A very good evening to all of you here in Wesley Hall at Highland Park United Methodist Church. We are incredibly blessed that you are with us today. Just real quick sample. How many of you folks are visiting today at the church for the first time? Yeah, this is great. We love having you here. You're always welcome. We love having you here. We happen to have worship services on Sunday. If you want to come back, we would welcome you on any Sunday, but we also love to have community events where the community just gets together for the common good and to learn new things. And wow, do we have an unbelievable privilege and opportunity to do that tonight. Before we do anything, I want to give a big shout out to Interabang Books. We have a wonderful partnership with them. We're huge fans of the independent bookstore, and there's nothing more rewarding. My wife Ashley and I love to just go in there and browse and visit. And they're kind, and they're nice, and they're informed about the books, and it's just such a wonderful experience. So I hope, if you haven't gotten books tonight, I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. There's a chance to do that again. But we really, really are grateful for their partnership, and the folks at Interabang do such a great job of being apprised of all the latest great books that are coming out. And it's just good to see those independent bookstores keep running because they're really important and vital to the community. So about 2008 or so, I called a good friend of mine, Dr. Christopher Crow, and I read anything that he tells me to read. And I happened to get him in the car. He was on a vacation. He was in a car, had a long drive. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm listening to this unbelievable new book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Outliers." And I said, "Oh, tell me about it, because I read everything that the good Dr. Crow tells me to read." And he started telling me about this thing called the 10,000 hour rule. And my interest was piqued, and then so I went and bought the book, and I learned all about the 10,000 hour rule. And I've always wanted to play the guitar. And I thought, well, how hard can this be? It says right there in the book, you log 10,000 hours. What it didn't tell you is that after about 100 of those hours, you get really tired and frustrated and cynical, and you sell your guitar. So I did not learn how to play the guitar, but I did discover an unbelievable new writer that made me think. And I dug back into the older books that he had written, all the way back to The Tipping Point, and I discovered someone that was so fascinating, and they had the unique and the unbelievable gift to take significant and serious research, but to marry it and to fuse it with just great storytelling. And in my world as a minister, that's pretty important. If you can take theology and marry that to storytelling, then sometimes people will remember what you have to say. And I found someone that was able to do that at just an unbelievable level. And so I'm so grateful for Mr. Gladwell's work. It really is terrific, and you guys are in for a huge treat tonight. The other reason I want to thank him publicly is because many Sundays I have nothing to say. And when I have nothing to say, I get a copy of David and Goliath and the Bible, and I just walk in the sanctuary, and away we go. And he gets nothing in terms of monetary benefit from that, but you have bailed me out many a Sunday, and I'm really, really grateful for that as well. 23 million books sold, and a little more tonight, apparently. So 23, and you don't do that by accident unless your stuff is really, really powerful, profound, and amazing. So we're so blessed tonight. Thought is important, and he makes us think. You're in for a treat because you have two folks up here tonight, and we're so honored and blessed to have Krys Boyd. If you have never heard Krys's work on the KERA program, Think, you can hear it daily at noon on over 200 radio stations, and you talk about diving into things that make you think. It is an award-winning show. She does a tremendous job of interviewing and fleshing out and digging out in great detail the work that she does to help all of us consider thought and become a little bit better. So I'll bring them both up here in just a moment. Before we do that, I'm going to say a quick prayer, and then we're going to get right after it because you've come to hear some remarkable speakers. So if you would, let's pray. Gracious and loving God, we are so blessed to be in folks that spend a lot of time helping other people think. And Lord, you've blessed us uniquely with intelligence and brains. And Lord, to use that muscle is a blessing. And so help us, Lord, just to receive folks that have spent a lot of time preparing ideas and concepts and stories and research to make the world better and to make us better at life and a little bit, maybe even make our lives a little bit better. So tonight, Lord, we ask that you would bless our guests. and you would open our minds and our hearts, that we would just receive what it is they have to share, so that when we leave, we will be more enriched than when we came and when we took a seat. Amen. So with that, friends, if you would give a warm Park City's welcome to Krys Boyd and Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Dallas.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the original Tipping Point was published in 2000, and since then, it's been such a touchstone that everybody uses that expression, which is not to say we're using it the way you intended it. So let's start with that. When you talk about a tipping point, what do you mean?
Well, it's the term that describes the moment when an epidemic changes shape or explodes. So if you remember in December of 2019, COVID was this mysterious thing somewhere in China, and there was like one story on NPR about whether we should be concerned about it. And then there was a day, I forgot, was it March 13th? There was a day in March, yeah, when suddenly everything shut down. Remember that? Well, that was a tipping point. That was this thing that we kind of heard about that was like somewhere off in another corner of the world becomes very real and relevant and everywhere. That change is the hallmark of an epidemic.
So now, revenge of the tipping point. Are we just in a much more cynical place than we were in 2000?
Well, yes. I mean, I don't know. Am I more cynical? I'm not a cynical person. I don't really believe in cynicism. I'm pretty optimistic. I'm just older. I mean, I wrote the original Tipping Point when I was in my 30s. And when I was in my 30s, I was a very young 30s. I did not behave I was not a grown man. And, when you're a kid, the world is full of possibility, and you tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. And when you're not a kid, maybe you have a little more of a realistic view about things. So this book is a little bit more, it's a little more clear-eyed than the first one.
So social epidemics can work in very surprising ways, sometimes good ways, sometimes bad ways. Why did Los Angeles become the bank robbery capital of the United States in the 70s and 80s when other places that would have a little spate of bank robberies did not?
Yeah. Well, this is, for those of you who are interested in bank robbing, bank robbery was sort of going out of style. And nobody was doing it much. And the FBI was really good at catching bank robbers. So, when they get really good at catching you, the only people who do it are people who aren't, terribly with it. So it's sort of going away. And then it suddenly undergoes this resurgence in the 80s. And if you look at bank robbery in America on a graph, the curve looks like that in the 70s, and the 80s rather. And it's sort of doubling every year. And the center of this is LA, for reasons that sort of are baffling to people at the time. But a quarter of all bank robberies by the end of the 80s are in Los Angeles. And there's a number of explanations, but what seems to be happening is that there are a number of incredibly flamboyant bank robbers in LA who kind of are they're turning this into a contagious. They're infecting other people in LA with this desire to rob banks. So there was a guy named the Yankee Bandit who he was called the Yankee Bandit because he would always wear a Yankees cap, and he was a note passer. Now there's a hierarchy of bank robbing, and the bottom is the note passers. They're the ones who stick their finger in their shirt, and then they pass a note and says, "I have a gun, give me your money." That's like entry level, right? But the Yankee Bandit's really good at this. And he robs something like, I forget, 40 banks in LA. He once does 6 in one day, which is like still a record, but it's a world record. I don't know
A
what.
lot of driving.
No, he's actually mostly walking around. But no, that is a lot of driving. And, but he's like he literally is just crossing the street and just doing another one. And he was pretty brazen. But people start hearing about the Yankee Bandit. And then there's this crucial moment in the history of LA bank robbing where, sort of FYI, if you are a manager of a bank and your bank gets robbed, the one thing you should never do is tell people how much money was taken. That's like the no-no. Like when they give you the briefing, the first thing they say is, do not tell me. Well, there's a bank robbed in the Valley, Wells Fargo, and the manager inadvertently tells the press how much was taken. It was $500,000. And what happens is, throughout LA, every like wannabe criminal, like here's that, I was like, wait a second, why am I selling crack? This is so much more lucrative. And these two brilliant guys in their early 20s who are Crips, member of the Crips, of the rolling 60s branch of the Crips, a guy named Casper and a guy named Sea Dog, who parenthetically got out of prison this summer, and my little podcast company has been in contact with them. They hear this and they're like, oh my God, this is fantastic. And they do this thing which is really interesting, which is, they're really smart, Casper and Sea Dog. They're like 21. At the time, if you remember in the early 90s, the big trend in corporate America was outsourcing. Like corporations were like sending their manufacturing overseas, having someone else do their Well, Casper and Sea Dog were like, we should not only become bank robbers, we should outsource the bank robbing. So they go to these high schools and they convince teenagers to do their dirty work for them. They give them semi-automatic weapons and they drive them to banks and they just send them in. They show them what you should do. Wave your gun around. Say, everyone on the floor, whatever you do. And they end up robbing 175 banks in a year and a half, which is, no one's even come close. I mean, no one's even, they're like the LeBron James of, no one's gonna break that record ever. It's an unbelievable achievement. And if you're living in a town where two dudes rob 175 banks in a year and a half, word gets around, right? So they become they spread the virus all around LA. But what was interesting to me about that was that it doesn't travel beyond LA. So in order to pick up this bank robbing virus, you have to be local. And I spend, as you know, if you've read the book, I spend a lot of time in the book trying to figure out why are epidemics of ideas so local, so regional, so specific to place, right? Because we think of a virus as something that spreads everywhere, but that's true of real viruses, but it's not true of ideas, epidemics of ideas and behavior.
So stay with us here because we're going to hop from bank robberies to healthcare. Talk about small area variation.
Yeah, so this is this thing which I got obsessed with, which is there's a guy named John Wenberg, and John Wenberg was just comes out of medical school in the 60s, and he's working for the federal government, and he gets sent to Vermont to study how healthcare is delivered in this Vermont, right? And so he goes around and he goes to one little town after another and collecting statistics. And he finds out something that doesn't make any sense, which is that you could have two adjoining towns in Vermont. He famously looked at Stowe and Waterbury, which if you're driving around Vermont, they're the same, right? And they're not that far apart. And he discovers that in Stowe, he was looking at things like, how often do people get their tonsils out? How often do women get a hysterectomy? How often do, just you name the kind of prosaic surgical procedure. There is a massive difference between Stowe and Waterbury. And he's living right on the Stowe-Waterbury line, and he sends his kids to Stowe High School. And he realizes that if he was sending, and he would get his health care at Stowe, And he realized that if he did Waterbury instead, that the chances that his kids would get their tonsils out would go from like practically non-existent to 100%. That's how different these two towns were. And he couldn't figure out, why would this be the case? There's no rational reason why doctors would behave one way here and one way there. He then replicates this, and it's become this huge movement in medical research that shows that the care you receive from your doctor varies dramatically by place. And I give the example of cardiologists in Buffalo behave dramatically differently than cardiologists in Boulder, Colorado. And this is not because they're all educated at top medical schools, they're all reading the same journals, they all have the same patient mix, they all read this, they're all using the same technology, but it's just different. And that led me into thinking that this must be true outside of medicine as well, that in ways that may not be apparent to us, where you live has a powerful impact on how you behave. And that led me to this strange conundrum of Miami, which, as long as I've been in America, I moved here when I was a young man, but not from here. I've always been struck by how utterly bizarre Miami is. It's like the nuttiest town it doesn't make any sense. Like, you go there, I have a friend who's a real estate developer in Miami, and basically she builds luxury condos on the beach. And she will be the first person to tell you that nothing is more nonsensical than building luxury condos on the beach. They're gonna get washed away. She knows that, the builders know that, the insurers know that. No one is fooled except the people who are plunking down $10 million for one of these apartments. Why? So you have an entire city that's doing something that makes absolutely no sense. So that's Miami. And the other thing, I don't talk about this in the book, but I'm old enough to remember Miami Vice. And in retrospect, it's the craziest television show. Because up until then, if you had a cop show, for those of you who don't remember, this was a cop show that was very popular in the 80s, late 80s. Don Johnson was one of these two cops, and the other guy was a guy that I don't think he ever did anything else again. But the whole conceit of the show is that these are two cops who are battling corruption in Miami. But in every other previous television show in which cops battled corruption, corruption was thought to be a bad thing. But the whole point of Miami Vice is that the two cops who are battling corruption, they're driving Lamborghinis and they're wearing Armani suits. And no one ever explains how this is possible on a police officer's salary. It's just taken for granted that, in Miami, well, of course they're gonna drive a Lamborghini. Nobody drives. I was walking around Highland Park today, a very wealthy neighborhood. I did not see a single Lamborghini. So clearly, what was that? But somehow this was normal in Miami Vice. So even then, there I was, a kid watching Miami Vice. It's like, what is going on in Miami? Anyway, so I try to explain why Miami is a weird place using the example of Medicare fraud, which no one commits more Medicare fraud in America than the residents of Miami. It's their specialty.
And the person you write about was a transplant, and by all accounts was a pretty decent guy before he arrived in Miami?
Yes. I tell the story of the great Philip S. Forms, who was such a character. He looks like Paul Newman. He drives a $1.5 million Ferrari. He had models stashed in luxury hotels throughout South Florida. He had two sons, who were both very, very short. And he was convinced that if they worked hard enough and had enough quality instruction from NBA players, they could start on a D1 basketball program. And if you go online, this is not in the book, but you should do this. Go online and just Google S. Forms basketball. You will see videos of his 5'4" son practicing jump shots under the tutelage of members of the Miami Heat. This guy's bizarre. And he lives in Chicago, where he runs a nursing home operation, which is relatively on the straight and narrow. And he moves to Miami, and he becomes, he ends up at the center of one of the largest Medicare frauds in the history of Medicare fraud. And the question is, why? Why would he go from being law-abiding to... And at his sentencing, his rabbi stands up and says, Philip was a great guy in Chicago, and then he moved here and he got ruined by Miami. And I thought I should write a whole chapter on taking the rabbi seriously. I think the rabbi was correct. I think the finger should be pointed, the finger of blame should be pointed at the city of Miami. Miami corrupted Philip S. Forms. And to my great displeasure, I never got a chance to meet Philip, but I did meet his attorneys, which was one of the most enjoyable afternoons of my life. Their case, do you mind if I digress?
Please.
I love digressing. So there's the two greatest defense attorneys, and forgive me if you're a defense attorney and you take umbrage at this. The two greatest defense attorneys, white-collar defense attorneys in this country, are these two guys in Miami, Roy Black and a guy named Howard Shrebnick. And there's another case they were involved in that involved Georgetown University and a guy, a really rich guy, who bribes the Georgetown tennis coach to let his daughter into Georgetown, even though she's not a very good tennis player. And they represented the guy who gave the bribe, which was $200,000 in cash in a brown paper bag. And they got him off, which I just thought, it was the last, you remember the Varsity Blues case? There were 56 Varsity Blues cases, and in all 56, the people pled guilty. And then they took the 57th one, and this was a guy who's like, I'm not pleading guilty. And they represented him and they got him off. And it is the most genius legal case of all time. So digression. I'm in Miami, in Boca. I have kids, I go to Boca. I'm sorry, that's what I do now. And I'm reading this case. It's like 2,000 pages. And it's riveting. And I'm on like page 1800. And I realize that Howard and Roy Black are in Miami and I'm in Boca. It's like really short. So I call them up and I'm like, I'm on page 1800 and I'm in Boca. Can I come and see you? They're like, come and see us. So I go down to Miami. And then I realized they had this other case involving Philip S. Forms. So they just talk about what it meant to be involved in one of the largest Medicare fraud cases in history. And anyway, all of this is about Miami because it turns out that in Miami, like if you look at levels of Medicare fraud around the country, in most places, it's really low, even though it's really easy to engage in Medicare fraud. I could teach you all. I'm not going to do it because you're law-abiding citizens and you all have careers. But if you want to, if you want to kind of come up to me afterwards, I can give you some pointers. Point is, it's really easy to rip off the government if you want to. But they do it in Miami with a level of audacity and with a certain exuberance and flamboyance that is not present anywhere else in the United States. Anyway, the king of this is this guy, Philip S. Forms. So what I wanted to figure out was, why is Miami the place where people are so extravagantly pursuing Medicare fraud? And it comes back to this thing that I was describing 4 iterations before in this long digression, which was there are these massive differences from town to town and city to city in America in the ways that people behave. And Miami is one of these places that when it comes to fraud, they're in a class by themselves. Don't move there.
So this narrative, this is how we do things here. That's what you call the overstory.
Yes. The argument I make in the book is that when you move to a town that has a very distinctive approach, a way of doing things, you get infected by that story, by that narrative. So it is like in Miami, when you move there are so many people who are behaving in a way that would otherwise seem untoward that you can't help but kind of get swept along. So there's a story I tell in Miami about in that Miami chapter about when the cocaine trade explodes in Miami in the early 80s. There is so much money laundering going on. This is before we kind of cracked down on money laundering, although we haven't really cracked down on money laundering. But what would happen is there was a guy, a famous money launderer, who worked for one of the big cartels. And every day he would pull up in front of a bank in downtown Miami, and he would pop the trunk of his car, and he would have a massive suitcase just full of cash every day. And the bank guard would come out and would help him carry the suitcase into the bank. So just imagine that for a moment. If you are a citizen of Miami and you're walking down the street, and every morning on your way to work, you witness a guy pull up with a suitcase full of cash, and the bank guard help him take that cash into the bank. How do you think that changes your perspective on, I don't know, life? On whether it's worth being a law-abiding citizen? On, how much can rules be bent in the modern economy? On, I don't know, it just, that does not happen in Minneapolis, right? There's a reason why, that's why one of the many ways in which Minneapolis is not like Miami. And if Philip Farms had moved to Minneapolis, he does not, I believe, engage in a high level of Medicare fraud. It's not in the air there.
So I have a particular fascination with unintended consequences, when people try to do the right thing and everything falls apart. I was really drawn to the pretty tragic chapter about the real city that you give the fictional name Poplar Grove.
Yeah, so this is a serious chapter. I ran across I don't know why I was interested. I got really interested in reading about teen suicide. And I ran across all of these papers written by these two researchers, a woman named Anna Muller and a guy named Seth Arberton, who had collaborated together on a series of studies of a town they called Poplar Grove. And they won't tell you what its real name is, although I figured it out and went there. And it is the perfect town. I was walking around Highland Park this afternoon. It's better than Highland Park. It's like this little suburban enclave where every house is gorgeous. The high school is the best high school in the state. The streets are windy, beautiful. There's an incredible sense of community. There's every amenity in the world. People love living there. Families never leave. It's perfect. Except that they have had a suicide epidemic at their high school that's gone on for 15 years. And these kids have taken their own lives who are not alienated, depressed, kids who seem to have everything going for them. And the town could not figure out why they couldn't shake this. Why here and why won't it stop when we're perfect, right? And so these two researchers go there and they spend years studying the town. And their conclusion is the epidemic is happening here not in spite of your perfection, but because of it. And that what has happened is that you have identified such a kind of clear and consistent pathway for your kids. If your kids if they go to this high school, they are expected to be, there's one way they should be. They have to be athletic, socially popular, attractive, good students headed for an Ivy League school. That's it, right? One way. And if you don't meet all those expectations, then you feel like a failure. And that is, in the normal high school, there are 10 different ways for a kid to feel they belong. There are 10 different identities they can join. Like if you think about your high school or my high school growing up, like a normal high school, my high school, there was a group of jocks, there was a group of kids who played Dungeons and Dragons. There were the art students, the drama kids who were dressed up in tights, and there were the, on and on, right? There were the computer club kids who wrote code, and it didn't matter who you were, you could find a group where you belonged, right? Nobody, if you weren't interested in any of it, there was a group who were just, dropouts, right? None of that diversity was what made the school resilient. It was what made it possible for everyone to feel like they belonged. Poplar Grove was a place that had one social group.
Monoculture.
It was a monoculture. And that made the town, the school, incredibly vulnerable to an epidemic, because if there was some problem that infected one person in that monoculture, it just raced through the whole school, right? There was no kind of natural barrier preventing a terrible idea from spreading. And that made them defenseless in the wake of a suicide epidemic, right? It's what's interesting about that story is that the parents created that world for their kids. They were the ones who created that vulnerability. And they thought they were doing their kids a favor, right? And they were not. They were, in fact, creating a situation that put their own children in peril. And I, as a parent myself, I think about that a lot. And I wonder how many of the things we do in the name of trying to create a better world for our kids actually have the opposite effect.
What is the magic third?
What is the magic third? We're just racing. Krys, we're just racing through this book right now. Can't even.
There's a lot to get to.
But they're good. They're all getting a copy. We can talk about whatever we want. We could digress again. Magic third. So there's a woman named Rosabeth Cantor, who's a sociologist, who wrote an article. She's written many brilliant things, but she wrote a paper in the early 70s, and when I read it for the first time, it was called The Theory of Group, I can't believe I don't remember the title. The Theory of Group Proportions. I think it was called The Theory of Group Proportions. And it's one of these papers where if you read it, I've read it maybe 10 times. It's one of it will change the way you see the world. And her argument was she'd been in the early 70s, a Fortune 500 company comes to her and said, we have a problem, we need your help. And they had been a company that had all male sales teams. And they decided to hire some women. It was a company that sold very, very technical equipment. So a salesperson there had to have a great deal of knowledge and expertise. So they hired all these women, and the women were not doing well, and they didn't know why. So they hire Rosabeth Cantor to investigate. So she comes in and she interviews, spends a huge amount of time talking to all these women who've been hired and the men who are on these teams. And her verdict was that first thing she says to the company was, you did not make a mistake with these women. They are fantastic at their job. Second thing she says is, there's nothing wrong with your company. It's not some noxious culture that, is holding the women back. It's not you. She said, your problem is you didn't hire enough women, right? And she forms this theory that says, we don't pay nearly enough attention to numbers when we talk about groups. And she says, there is a world of difference between being one woman in a group of 20 men and being one of 5 women in a group of 20 men. That when you're the only one, when you're a distinct minority, you're a token. You're not taken seriously. You can never be yourself. You're never comfortable. You're both overlooked and also scrutinized. I mean, there are tons of women in this room, and you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? When you're the first one in, it is really, really hard to be yourself. It's really, really hard to perform at a top. And the men don't understand what you're going through. They have no appreciation for it. And I could say the same thing about being the first black person in a group of white people, being the first whatever. When you're an outsider, joining a group that is otherwise homogeneous It's really, really hard at first, until your group reaches a critical mass. So her whole argument was, we need to pay attention to group proportions. You know, whether the group that you belong to is above or below the moment of critical mass is hugely important in understanding your own performance in that group. She does this really brilliant thing where she was saying, a lot of the stereotypes we hold about women, we hold them because we observe the behavior of women in situations where they do not have critical mass. So there were all these famous studies that were done in the 60s of the way women behaved in juries. And they would say, we look at a jury and the men take these leadership roles, they dominate the conversation, they set the stage, and the women are very reactive. And that's something that's maybe powerfully characteristic of the way women behave. And she would say, wait a minute, that's nonsense. You observed the way women behaved in a condition where the women made up 10% of the group, right? Come back to me when the women make up 50% of the group and see whether those same observations hold true, right? And I just thought this was such an incredibly fascinating way of looking at the world. And so I took that idea and talked about this but basically what she's describing is that there is a tipping point in the lives of groups when minorities of whatever kind reach a certain point. And I think, so the question that she raised was, what's that point? What's that point of critical mass? What's that tipping point in a group? And she thought it was somewhere around a quarter to a third. And so I did all this investigation and talked to women who had been in situations like, I have a whole thing where I was talking to women who had been on corporate boards about what was it like when you were the only one on the board? What was it like when there were two of you? What was it like when there were three of you, right? Did it change? And they all said the same thing, which was, when I was the only woman on the board, it was impossible. When there were two of us, it was still impossible. When there were three of us, it was like, boom, it just changed. And suddenly we were seen, right? It was exactly the phenomenon that she was describing. There was this transformation in the way we see somebody when they were numbers. And it made me think that, you know, a lot of our discussion about diversity in this country is lacking because we don't talk enough about numbers. And we don't talk about the fact that bringing in one outsider is not enough, right? You're not going to change the dynamic. You got to really start thinking about how many outsiders you bring in if you want to really bring about a transformation in the way the group operates.
So then you looked at the racial achievement gap and the fact that black students don't perform as well as white students in schools where black students are the minority and white students are the majority. Talk us through that, because a lot of us have heard that there is an achievement gap, but we don't necessarily know all the nuances behind that.
So this is one, I should caveat this, and I say that I give a caveat in the book. It's one study, so using one data set. So we can't run away and draw a massive conclusion, but it's interesting and suggestive. So we've observed for a long period of time that there is a gap in test scores between black and white students in America, right? Gap is maybe half a standard deviation. And there are all kinds of reasons why this might be true, right? And we know what all those reasons might be. But somebody comes along and does a study, a group of researchers, where they say, okay, let's play with one of the variables. Let's look at, when we look at the presence of this gap, let's also look at how many black students are in the classroom whose test scores we're looking at. And what they find is that when there's one or two black students in a classroom, you see this big gap that you always see. But when the number of black students in a classroom goes above the tipping point, the test score gap disappears. In other words, maybe what we're observing when we're observing the test score gap between black and white students is the particular difficulties black students have when they are tokens, when they are the same thing that Rosabeth Cantor was observing with women years ago in that study, in in that company, that it's really hard to be, if you're an outsider in a group, it's really hard to be yourself and perform at a high level when your group is present only in small numbers. And that there is something that magical that happens when you've got critical mass. And so, to my mind, what that suggests to us is that we should really be experimenting with this, and we should see. We should be looking for much more evidence of, does the performance of black students change when they have sufficient numbers? Should schools who have a small number of black students, should they experiment with putting those students together in one class, right? So they get to at least in that class, they get to above the tipping point. I don't know. I mean, it's just a very, once you get into this world of thinking about group dynamics like this, it causes you to come up with all kinds of different ideas about ways of attacking performance deficits in various groups.
It's a really interesting idea. I can also imagine it would be a very fraught road to travel for the school administrator that said, I'm going to put all the black kids in one classroom and all the white kids in another classroom.
Impossible.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be impossible, because there's something about playing with group proportions that really kind of freaks us out, right? It's, I say that as someone who has written a lot about racial dynamics in this country. I come from that racially diverse background myself. For the longest time was very, very, hostile to the idea of quotas. But doing that chapter made me think, I don't know, man, there should be times and places where we take group proportions seriously. And if the evidence says that minority students do better when they have numbers in a classroom, then we shouldn't let our qualms about thinking in terms of numbers prevent us from helping the performance of those students. Really, all that should matter is, what is the condition under which students perform at their best, right? That should be the only thing that matters. And if that leads us into a place that's a little bit uncomfortable, so be it.
All right, since we're already uncomfortable, what did you learn about why so many Ivy League schools invest so much time and treasure in fielding teams of these pretty arcane sports that probably only students at the very most exclusive prep schools have ever played?
Well, you should know that my absolute favorite thing to do in the whole world is bash the Ivy League. It's like, if you listen to my podcast, you know that not a season goes by when I don't do a cheap shot.
Where did you go to school?
I went to the state school, University of Toronto. My tuition was $990 a year.
Canadian dollars.
Canadian dollars. And when they raised it to $991, we protested. We had signs. So great. I remember we were carrying these big signs, highway robbery. That's what, we were so incensed by the, this is not an exercise in self-loathing. This is an exercise of punching up. No, I have all kinds of problems, and if you like, I could just spend the rest of this time just giving you all the reasons why I loathe them. Can I just say, just giving you one that's top of mind. So, the University of Toronto, which I attended, and which I will say is considered by Canadians to be maybe one of the better Canadian universities. Do you know how many undergraduates attend the University of Toronto? This is our best school. Now, Canada, keep in mind, is a country of, 35 million people, I think. It's roughly 1/10 the size of America, 38. It's 1/10 the size of America. University of Toronto has an undergraduate population of 70,000 students.
Wow.
70,000. The undergraduate population of Harvard is what? Is it 11,000, right? So if proportionately if Harvard was the same size as the University of Toronto in proportion to the, right, it would have 700,000 students. Right? So you realize when you look at the size of the Ivy League, it's preposterous. They claim to be the greatest and most important educational institutions in this country. They don't educate anybody. Harvard's got $60 billion in the bank and they educate 11,000 students? Are you kidding me? And they pride themselves on how few people they accept. This is the nuttiest notion I have ever heard in my entire life. If we went to what's the best hospital in Dallas?
Oh, I'm not going there.
Whatever it is, SMU Medical Center, I don't know what it is. Imagine if the best hospital in Dallas said, not only are we the best hospital in Dallas, but here's why we're the best hospital. We turn down 95% of the patients who come here. We are so exclusive that we will only, no. The measure of a good hospital is how many people it treats, right? Yeah, if you're good, then you try and treat as many people as you, right? So somehow with schools, we have the reverse, where we somehow think, oh, yeah, that school's so good, it educates virtually no one. Right? This is bananas. And also, they have all the money. They could, if they wanted to, they could be 10 times bigger. They have 60, whatever it is. I forgot the last thing. They lost a little bit of money recently. They may be down to their last 45 billion, I'm not sure. But do you know that if you look at, I think all of the Ivy League combined educates fewer students than the University of Toronto. I mean, this is just bananas. Anyway, I could go on. I once calculated, sorry, I love this so much. I once calculated that, you know how endowments work? The school with the biggest endowment is Princeton, on a per capita basis. Their endowment is so large. You know, the way it works is you take 5% of the earnings from your endowment every year, and you use that to offset your operating expenses, right? That's the way it works. 5%, when Princeton takes 5% from its endowment every year, that number is so large that it is more than the total amount of its operating budget, right? So, for example, last year, if they the 5% they took out of their endowment earnings was so large that they could cover their entire budget and still return $1 billion to the endowment. In other words, they could tell every student, it's free now. They could say to the government, we don't need your grants anymore. They could have free parking on Nassau Street in downtown Princeton. They could make the whole thing a freebie and still have money left over, right? And yet, alumni of Princeton still give money every year to Princeton. Why would you give money to an institution that not only doesn't need your money, but could exist in perpetuity if no one ever gave money to it? There could be a nuclear conflict that wipes out the entire state of New Jersey, and Princeton would still keep going, because it's a perpetual motion machine. It's just like, they're just spinning off so much cash, and yet graduates of Princeton who claim because they went to Princeton that they're intelligent, thoughtful people, still give money to their institution. I just find this, I was once...
We got to get back to field hockey at some point.
Okay, we get it. So what's that dinner party? Sitting next to someone who went to Princeton, and I said, "Do you give money?" I go, "Yeah, I give money." And I ruined the dinner party, as you can imagine. Anyway, what was the question? The question, yeah. So, I couldn't write a book and not bash the Ivy League, because that's what I do. That's why God put me on this earth. Someone has to do it. So I got really interested in the fact that a couple years ago, Harvard decided to add women's rugby to its list of D1 sports. Now, the reason this is interesting is that Harvard already participates in more Division I sports than any other school in the country. No one's even close. Everyone thinks that it's the big state schools that are, no. The most sports crazy, athletics crazy university in the entire country is Harvard University. Harvard University has more student athletes than any school in the country. They spend more money on, it's unbelievable how obsessed they are with, and not only that, but if you are a D1 athlete, you get a massive preference on admissions. There's a back door, they have the front door, which is for smart kids who score really high it's really hard to get in the front door. Then they have the back door. The back door is for children of rich people, legacies, and athletes. And athletes of those three groups, well, actually it's not. If you give 20 million, someone told me, I tried to figure out how much do you need to give to Harvard and they'll just let you in? It's 20 million apparently at the moment, although it might be going down, which I thought is really low. Shouldn't it be higher? Why are they giving it away that? Anyway, so you can give 20 million. That's what will get you in. If you're a legacy, you get a break. But the athlete break is massive, the preference, right? So my question is why? Why? I understand why you would want to have athletes in your school. That makes sense. I was a college athlete. It's a good thing. But I didn't get a break in admissions because I was a good runner. And I don't understand why. And Harvard gives these things out they give it out to people who are good sailors. Why would you give, you're sailing in a yacht somewhere and the person's really good at it and you're like, wow, did you go to Harvard University? Why? So I found this very puzzling. So there's a great court case that happened a couple years ago. This is the case that ended up before the Supreme Court. But in the federal trial, when someone was, remember this was the group representing Asian students sued Harvard over their discriminatory admissions practices. And during the trial, all of the Harvard admissions people were basically testified. And at one point in the trial, the head of admissions at Harvard is asked this question. Why are you guys so nuts about sports? What's going on? Why would you do this? And this guy cannot answer the question. He can't answer it. One of the answers, he goes, well, we think that kids who are involved in sports bring something very valuable to the college experience. Well, no, they don't. Some rower who is getting up at 5 a.m. to row in the Charles for 3 hours, what are they adding to the college experience? They have to go to bed at 9 a.m. because they're getting up at 4. They're exhausted all day. And do people go to regattas? No, they don't. They're not adding anything. They're never there. They're always going to regattas everywhere. So that doesn't make any sense. And then they say, then he goes, well, we recruit a lot of students from Texas and Florida, and students from those states expect to have a strong sports athletic presence at their school. So he basically throws everyone from your state under the bus and says the only reason someone from Texas would want to go to Harvard is if they have great sports. Wait, that's nonsense. It's not true. Anyway, anyone who goes to Harvard for the sports shouldn't be going to Harvard. That's my perspective. So basically, it doesn't make any sense. So I tried to figure out, okay, what's really going on here? And my conclusion is that the sports they really love are sports that are really expensive, country club sports, right? We're not talking about running here. We're not talking about basketball. We're not talking about football. We're talking about what the sports they really, really go all crazy about are tennis, golf, fencing, rugby. Do you see where I'm going with this? Sailing, right? Sports that cost a lot of money to play and that only a very, very small fraction of kids can ever be good at, right? If you say we're going to give a special break to kids who play rugby, well, who plays rugby in America? Well, kids who go to private schools. You're basically saying we're giving a special admissions preference we're making sure that we have a large number of private school kids in our school, even if they couldn't get in the front door, right? Even if they're not smart enough to get in. We're reserving a spot for, how do you if you're going to play D1 tennis, I go on and on about tennis in this chapter. The only way to play D1 tennis is if you play junior tennis. The only way to be good at junior tennis is if your parents are prepared to spend at least $100,000 a year on your game, right? Otherwise, you're not playing D1 tennis, right? Not happening. Well, I mean, how many parents in this country can afford to spend $100,000 on their kids' ground strokes, right? Very, very small number. If you set aside 6 slots a year for tennis players, you're setting aside 6 slots a year for kids whose parents are rich enough to spend $100,000 on your ground game. It's a really naked exercise in class dynamics. They're trying to make sure that they have sufficient numbers of privileged kids at their school, right? It's about nothing other than that. And that offends me. I'm sorry, it offends me. You call yourself a meritocratic institution that stands for everything that's wonderful and beautiful about higher learning, and you're playing this double game where you're letting in jocks and rich kids in the back door? No. That's like nonsense. Stop it, right? It offends me. So anyway, there's a very delightful, angry chapter in the middle of the book where Malcolm unveils yet another argument against elite education in the United States. By the way, the finest one I ever did, if I might be regarding for a moment, is the podcast episode I did that was attacking Bowdoin College because their food was really good in the dining hall. And it was an episode that contrasted the dining hall food at Vassar, where the food's terrible, and Bowdoin, where the food's great. And my point was, don't go to Bowdoin. Because when a school, the whole problem with elite education right now is that schools are competing over amenities. That's why your tuition goes up every year. That's why tuition is like $60,000. It's not about the education. It's not about the history prof and the chemistry class. No, it's about the amenities. And if parents and students expect to get lobster bisque at dinner in the dining hall, then schools are going to have to compete on this crazy level. No, the only way to bring sanity back to elite education in this country is for the food in the dining hall to be terrible again. Bring back, and at Vassar, it was hilarious. I go there, and they have famously terrible food. And they were like, the guy who, head of admissions at Vassar told me, he's like, if you want good food in the dining hall, you should not come to Vassar. That's not what we do. He did not survive, sadly, in that position after my podcast aired. But anyway, I didn't realize we're on the campus of SMU. I have no idea what the campus food is like. Somebody maybe can tell me if they're an offender or on the right side of this particular issue.
I'm struggling to figure out which story I want you to tell because we're running out of time here. But let's do this. Let's go back to small area variation. Why do Illinois and Indiana, 2 states that are quite similar demographically and in a lot of ways, share 160 miles of border? Why do they have vastly different rates of opioid addiction?
Yes, they did. It's quite striking. And so did Texas and Oklahoma, and so did California and Nevada, and so did New York and Massachusetts. All neighboring states that have many things in common. In each of those cases, California got off easy, Nevada got walloped. Texas got off relatively easy, Oklahoma got walloped. New York got off easily, Massachusetts got walloped. Illinois got off easily, Indiana got walloped. The interesting thing is if you look at the pattern of the opioid crisis, it was incredibly specific to place. It was not the case that this was a national epidemic. It was this case that it was an epidemic that hit a certain number of states really hard, and other states were, relatively speaking, spared. And it has to do with this incredibly obscure regulation that started in California in the 1930s. A guy named Paul Madden, who was a drug crusader in the 30s in California, was so obsessed with the possibility that doctors might be prescribing opioid painkillers in a lax manner that he instituted something called a triplicate prescription pad. That when you wrote a prescription for an opioid, he made a list of the opioids that were available in the 30s in California. If you wanted to prescribe any opioid on that list, you had to use a special pad provided by the state that had 2 carbon copies. Top copy you had to keep, second copy was sent to the state, third copy was held by the pharmacy. So the state had a permanent record of every opioid that was prescribed in the state of California, who got it and who prescribed it. And his notion was that if you did that, a doctor would think twice about prescribing an opioid in a reckless manner, because they would know that somebody was watching. This was, for the longest time, everyone thought, oh, California, they're all crazy and paranoid, why are we doing this, blah, blah, blah. Over time, over the next sort of 30 or 40 years, a handful of other states adopted the same rule. Texas, Illinois, New York State, and I'm missing one other one. And was it Maryland? Maryland, yeah. And when the opioid crisis rolls, when OxyContin comes along, the states that had those policies on the books, the doctors in those states were incredibly reluctant to prescribe OxyContin recklessly. And not only that, Purdue Pharma was reluctant to aggressively market in those states because they knew it wasn't going to work. Doctors weren't going to prescribe, so they avoided. Purdue Pharma focused on the states that did not have one of those laws on the books. Right? So we had this pattern that begins back in the 1930s, which conditions the shape of the opioid crisis 90 years later. Right? It's really fascinating. It's this reminder that, like, if you ever think that government regulations don't matter, then you should go back and read that chapter, because they are a reminder that the laws that we pass and the regulations we pass can sometimes have a profound effect on the way our society functions in ways that we may not anticipate.
That chapter lays it all out so beautifully. And it all makes perfect sense in hindsight. Such perfect sense that we feel as if we ought to have been able to tell back in 1939, when California passed this obscure law, what the consequences might be of states that did or didn't follow its lead. Nobody, not even you, Malcolm, have a crystal ball. What is the value of going back in hindsight and re-examining things to try and understand why they happened?
Well, I mean, in that particular instance, it's very interesting. For years and years and years leading up to the opioid crisis, pharmacists, so the people who were directly involved with prescribing opioids, and largely the pharmacist community, had an ongoing debate for a generation about this exact policy. It was super nerdy. It was taking place in, like, special, small little kind of conferences of pharmacy execs and pharmacists and health policy experts. But people were having this discussion of how important are these kinds of regulations that affect the way that doctors prescribe opioids, and how important is it for us to keep an eye on opioid prescriptions. This is years before OxyContin came on the scene. And there was a strong contingent of people in that world who said, we're playing with fire here. If you let doctors do whatever they want, unscrupulous doctors do whatever they want with opioids, you're asking for another epidemic. They said that repeatedly on the record over and over and over again in the years leading up to the opioid crisis. And the states that listened to those people were the states that kept those triplicate laws on the books. And those states, I had someone calculate for me how many people were, if Massachusetts had followed New York's lead in having a triplicate prescription, how many people would be alive today in Massachusetts who otherwise died of overdoses? And it's in the tens of thousands. We're not talking about trivial numbers here, right? And I think the reason you go back and you study that is, it is a reason to take people who are experts in fields of policy like that seriously, right? And I wonder sometimes now, and this is not an ideological statement at all. I'm not taking sides between Republicans and Democrats remotely. But whatever side you're on, if you're trying to affect a change in what you think is for the better in the way this country operates, you have to take government and the expertise of people in government seriously. And you have to take the expertise of people in the regulated communities seriously. And you have to work over time to bring about a change. You cannot just walk in and say, boom, it's all different now, I'm cleaning house. Never works, right? Changing, like an issue that I feel very strongly about, it's not in my book, but I think that this country, the root of an incredible number of the problems we have in this country is that we don't build enough housing. I just think so many of the anger and resentment and stuff is about the fact that we have made it impossible for people under the age of 30 in many parts of this country to even dream of owning their own home, right? Gotta fix it. Fixing that problem, you can't fix that problem by waving a magic wand. You have got to work at in an incredibly close, long-term, detailed way with multiple constituencies over time to unravel a mountain of regulations that have built up over 100 years that have the effect of throttling the production of new housing. It's going to take 10 years. It's going to take 1,000 meetings behind closed doors, wading through mountains of documents. It's going to take patience and perseverance and thoughtfulness and intelligence and dedication, right? Well, the story of the opioid crisis is about that same thing. It's like details matter when it comes time to, and the people who paid attention to the details of how opioids were prescribed, their states got off easy in the opioid crisis. And the people who blew it off, their states suffered, right? There is a lesson in that for how we can, for how societies function.
Malcolm, thank you so much.
Thank you. Which way do we go? That's right.
Well, we're so glad that you came tonight. You were able to join us. Please be safe going home. I want to give a big shout out again to our fine folks at Interabang Books. We're so grateful for making this happen tonight, and to Krys and to Malcolm. Really, really wonderful night of some great thought, and you have a lot to take away with you tonight. So please be safe, and we'd love to see you back at Highland Park anytime.